so much of Pesach and Passover is not just about freedom, but it's also about freedom of coming out, like coming from a really bad place, whatever that is, enslavement, or what, according to many, specifically in Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, they like to talk about Egypt as being that narrow place, Mitzrayim, which in Hebrew could also mean these like narrow straits and narrow place. At my own bat mitzvah / coming out celebration, naming that I had a few months after I came out, one of the intentions given by one of the rabbis was "B'chol dor v'dor chayav adam lirot et atzma ki'ilu yatsa miMitzrayim." And every generation, we need to see ourselves as though we're coming out of Egypt. And it's not just a metaphorical, hypothetically, imagine yourself 3,000 years ago, you're building, pyramids in Egypt. I think it's a lot more direct. And I will say that for some people, they find that sometimes surprising to hear that. For me, having grown up in a Hasidic and ultra-Orthodox community, Pesach wasn't so much about, 3,000 years ago we were enslaved in Egypt and whatever, which today, I think maybe parts of the story happened, other parts, who knows. But it was always about the message of our own personal exodus, our own personal Yitziat Mitzrayim. You can't, to me, this is like coming out of the closet, coming out of that narrow place that either society or our families or our communities are putting us in. And Pesach is coming out of the closet. And I need to say, for me, over the past few years and specifically a few months, I've been very focused on celebration as opposed to tolerance. Because a lot of people talk about tolerating and accepting the LGBTQ community. And I use Pesach a lot as an example that the Jewish way is when there's something bad and you get out of that bad place, you don't just tolerate it, you celebrate. Coming out, as in the LGBTQ community and beyond, I think the same will go for race liberation. The same goes for people of different economic and socioeconomic backgrounds who are working towards liberation. It's not just, okay, fine, I'm no longer there. Our reaction is, this is amazing, and we create a holiday. And I think for Pesach specifically, it's not just one holiday. It's every Shabbat, and every holiday ends up being Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim, remembering that leaving of the narrow place, which is very true for the LGBTQ community, because everything we do, people tell me sometimes I should just move on, and like, why do you keep talking about it? And in many ways, that's what we were told as Jews. You don't move on from Egypt. You constantly need to remember that narrow place, because both to be grateful, to know what we have overcome, and to make best use of every day we have out of the closet. So to me, that is the overarching message of Pesach. So it's not just, what does Pesach have to do with LGBTQ? It's like everything. What is Pesach if not for coming out? If I need to add a fifth question, to me it's very similar to if I need to add a fifth child to the 4 children of the Haggadah. I would think a lot about the questions that are being shut down. Whatever it is, from religious communities, from people who don't like to listen to outsiders. And by outsiders, I mean to people who are different than them. And once again, it, to me personally, refers to the LGBTQ and specifically transgender community, but it goes beyond that. It's the same for everyone who has at any point in their life has been seen as their other. And my question would be, why, even on a night when we're told to ask questions, there's still so many questions that some people don't want to listen to? Why is the fact that even for me, I can't go to my parents and start asking them on that night, why can't I be part of your community, part of your family? Why is it that there's still so many people who don't have a Seder to be at simply because of their gender or sexual identity? To me, that is the fifth child. Not the smart child, not the wicked one, not the simple one, not the one who doesn't know how to ask questions, but the one who is not even invited, the one who is told, don't show your face, we don't want to see you, we don't want to have you. So I would add stuff to both the Seder and the Seder plate. Let's start with the Seder plate. So some of the things that have already been added and that I already add, there's the orange, which is a very popular one, and it's supposed to include everyone. I would say specifically adding something that represents the LGBTQ community, and people could get creative with that. I think the Seder already has enough rigid, set in stone customs. How about this is a time to be more open, which by that alone represents the LGBTQ community. But whatever it is, a certain fruit, something that is cooked or baked, something that obviously makes sense. Like I feel like adding a rainbow flag might be a good decoration, but it doesn't. It's not a Seder plaything. But adding something specifically, I know I have in the past add different colored vegetables. I have add which I got the idea from Easter, dare I say. But I added, a lot of people do an egg, like that's the beitza, the egg on the Seder plate. I added egg that has been dyed, in a different color. We can play around with that, but I think it should be something that is intentional, something that you and the people who are there know that this is intentionally adding to welcome the LGBTQ community. I think just like we need to add for other Jewish communities and people and families that have for far too long been left out from the default. Now, with the Seder alone, one of the first things that I added to the Seder, unrelated to LGBTQ originally, when I started hosting my own Seders. So after I left my family in 2012, and then for a while I didn't have much to do with anything. I was very angry and on everything Jewish. And even after I knew that most Jews are not ultra-Orthodox, it took me a while to get over that part. But once I did and I started doing my own Seders, one of the first things I added was an appetizer before we start anything. Because in my experience, most people, I know in my family, Magid alone, the Haggadah alone, before the meal takes like 2-3 hours. But even without it, even someone who just very briefly goes through the Haggadah will take like an hour and a half, 2 hours before the meal. So I added, usually it will be like some form of like latkes or a mashed potato latkes, and then like I've been making matzah meal pancakes, kremzlich in Yiddish, just like to have someone to start off with. And now when I'm thinking of that in the context of the LGBTQ community, it makes me think of a lot of LGBTQ people who are struggling also with food security, with access to a safe place, a safe haven, and so on. So much of adding something to the Seder, and in this case, adding before Kadesh, we add, I don't know how to call it in Hebrew, to add a 16th siman to the Haggadah, but it would be to start off with food, because we need to keep in mind that people could show up to our Seders who haven't had access to food for a while. Food security is not just a matter of economic justice or economic freedom and like eradicating poverty. Obviously, it's where the intersectionality comes in, and the fact that LGBTQ people, specifically trans people and trans women of color, tend to struggle more with food security than a lot of other people. So adding this acknowledgement that we know that some people are coming to this Seder, to this massive meal, to this big, let's call it a party, who are really hungry, not because they are waiting for the Seder or for Kiddush, because they don't have access to food. So to me, adding that initial, let's start with eating something, is a way of both remembering and also the symbolic thing of we need to think more of people who do not have safe access and secure access to food. I would split this up in two. I would say there's a childhood memory and there's a more contemporary modern memory. The childhood one of Pesach, to me, has always been the 4 questions. And what I mean by that is not the actual questions, but a lot of families have the custom that only the youngest child or just one child asks the questions. And in my family, everyone asks the questions. So, for example, at my father's Seder, it will be all of us, boys and girls, which is very uncommon for girls specifically, to take an official role. Everyone asks the questions individually. So usually the older ones only say in Hebrew, and the younger ones do Hebrew and Yiddish. And the very young ones sometimes only do something in Yiddish. But even more so when it stood out to me was at my grandfather's Seder. So my grandfather, who was a Hasidic Rebbe, he does the Seder in his synagogue with a lot of people. And it's that one time when the women still sit separately, usually on a separate table, but in the same room. And the women, everyone would stand up. Like my aunt, who is 50 years old, and the small cousin, my cousin, who's 10 years old, boys, girls, everyone stands up and asks the questions individually. And it takes sometimes time. So as a young child, sometimes it would get a bit annoying when like it takes half an hour for everyone to ask the questions. But now when I look back at it, and I think it's maybe not directly LGBTQ related, but specifically for me, I identified as a woman since I remember myself, since I was really young. And that was like that one thing a year that in such a gender segregated community where I grew up in, there was some form of equality. It went according to age, so it didn't like start with the boys and then to the girls, which is very common in the Hasidic community. It went like in my grandfather's home. The oldest child is a girl, my aunt. She would start and then go down to all the kids. It felt this, I don't want to call it feminist necessarily, but it was this one time, not just during the Seder, but this one time of the year where I felt there was some kind of equality. I could stand up and do something, and yes, I was sitting in the men's section because that's what I was told, but I didn't have to feel like, oh, maybe I shouldn't do it. It doesn't belong to me. So that is definitely one of my favorite, I would say, childhood and growing up memories of the Seder. Some of the more modern ones, and specifically up to COVID, was I always threw big Seders. At the peak, I once cooked and hosted a Seder from A through Z, meaning I made all the food. I do 5-course Seder meals plus the appetizers. And at a peak, I had 30 people, and we have people of literally every background. I'm talking people of every Jewish background, people of so many non-Jewish backgrounds that we invited into our home. And I really enjoy it personally. Both the cooking and like I always post pictures on Instagram and on social media, but also the bringing people together. And I remember the last time, 2 years ago, 2019, which was the last time I did a big one before the apocalypse hit, so to speak. I had a few of my friends who also grew up Orthodox and Hasidic and have left the community, but then one of my best friends who grew up in a Mormon community and was excommunicated, and she was sitting at the table. Another friend of mine who is a student at Yale Divinity School, and like so on. So we have people of all different backgrounds, and it was so interesting. Like we were sitting and comparing different customs and different traditions. It's like a Seder is like a sit-down meal where there's so many interesting customs. And specifically my friend who grew up Mormon, and then us, kind of like my friends who grew up Hasidic and I, we kept comparing who is more cult-like, and we got to the conclusion that both of our communities are very culty. But it's a really sweet and amazing opportunity, and I'm looking forward, hopefully next year. We said already last year in 2020, we all said, next year in person, L'Shana Haba in person, and it doesn't look like it's going to happen this year, but hopefully next year, and I can once go back and have people called Dichfen Yeseh V'Yechol, as the Nusach of the Seder goes, before the Manishtana, everyone who wants, and to really have that like multicultural experience that makes the Seder so beautiful. I would say ultimately the most important message when I think about LGBTQ and the Seder, LGBTQ and Pesach, is to be intentional. So much of the Seder, so much of Pesach can be triggering to people who grew up in religious communities, either because there's a lot of restrictions, there's a lot of, for example, I know me personally, I've been sober for 6 years, so alcoholism and like addiction can be a hard thing, specifically on Pesach. With the LGBTQ community, so many people that I know who grew up in religious communities or LGBTQ have all these very negative memories of the Seder because in many ways it's a Jewish equivalent of like Thanksgiving when always, I had this creepy uncle who made some homophobic comment. I had that person made a transphobic comment. For many Jews, that's the Seder. And for many LGBTQ Jews, there's too many negative memories. Whatever it is, the grandmother asking when they're going to get married to a boy, to a girl, expecting a certain rigid lifestyle, wherever it's just sitting at the table and listening to traditional and modern ideas that are literally erasing at best and often openly discriminatory against who we are. So I think it's very important for us to always, and specifically at the Seder, on a holiday like Pesach, to be intentional, because ultimately, this Pesach could be all about LGBTQ acceptance and celebration. But for too many people, it hasn't been. So just being intentional of that, realizing people have had struggles with that, some people are still struggling with that, and how we create our holiday, our Yom Tov tables, our Seder tables, to make sure that it really is inclusive for everyone.